Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be listening from or watching from this morning. I'm Dick Morningstar. I'm the founding chair of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council, and I am really very happy to be working with and joining with the Eurasia Center this morning to launch the report by Stephen Fisher and Anders Åslund on new challenges and dwindling returns for Russia's national champions, being, of course, Gazprom and Rosneft. And I might say, I think this is just a terrific report. And we're going to have a wonderful panel discussing the issues that the report talks about. Also, I'm sure you can find the report now on the Atlantic Council website. Just a few administrative details. What we're going to be doing, we'll hear first from the panelists, and then maybe some questions from me. Then we'll go to questions and answers from the audience. You can put in your questions in the icon on your screen, and then I should be able to see them from there. You can also follow what's going on Twitter either at AC Eurasia or capital A, capital C Eurasia, or AC Global Energy. Let me introduce the panelists today. Of course, the two authors, Stephen Fisher, who worked 35 years at Citibank and was the corporate bank head in Moscow for Citibank during really the boom days of the Russian energy sector in the early 2000s, and is truly an expert. And of course, our own Dr. Anders Åslund, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center, who I would say is probably the leading economist in the world on issues relating to Russia, to Ukraine, to Eastern Europe. Dr. Agnia Grigas, who's also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council Eurasia Center. She's an author of several books and is an associate at the Argonne National Laboratory and serves as an advisory board member for many institutions and companies. And finally, my old friend for many, many years, Ed Chow, who's now a non-resident senior associate, sort of retired, I guess, Ed, at CSIS in their climate change and energy program. And so those will be the four panelists, and I'll turn to in a moment. I will just say that I do think that this report is exceptionally timely, given what's happened to oil and gas markets because of the corona pandemic. That's already exacerbating challenges that Gazprom and Rosneft are facing. The oil price war that took place earlier this spring, which Russia was sort of the leading actor, although prices have seemed to stabilize some in the high 30s since then. And also even recent events that Rosneft has run into as to the difficulties they've had in dealing with the Venezuela situation and getting themselves into issues with the United States on additional sanctions for Rosneft, all sorts of issues. So it's a murky situation. There are challenges ahead for the two companies. It's interesting to speculate on what kind of role they can continue to play in the global marketplace. And enough from me. Let me turn it over now to the first panelist, Stephen Fisher, who will basically outline the major points that are in the report. Stephen?
Thank you, Ambassador Morningstar, and hello to all of our global viewers. Thank you very much to the Atlantic Council for organizing today's webinar. Today we discuss Russia's two natural resource champions, Gazprom and Rosneft. These enormous companies play key roles in Russia and Russia's abroad. In 2019, Gazprom produced 60% of Russia's and 11% of the world's natural gas. Rosneft produced 41% of Russia's oil and 6% of the world's oil. Together, these companies earned $252 billion in revenue and $32 billion in net profit. They employ 800,000 people, which is over 1% of Russia's total labor force. They are both publicly listed companies, and the majority controlling shareholder is the Russian state. In 2008, at the height of the commodity boom, Vladimir Putin bragged about them as unstoppable industry global leaders. In 2020, however, the heyday of high oil and gas prices is past, and Gazprom and Rosneft facing comeuppance. International competitors are outpacing them in market valuation, global and regional market access, capital investment, and revenue cost efficiency. Oil and gas market dynamics have changed massively, in particular, due to the unprecedented explosion in liquefied natural gas production and the rise of the United States as a dominant oil producer and future global exporter. Western sanctions, the EU antitrust case against Gazprom, and Gazprom's recent international arbitration losses have presented serious challenges to the way these companies operate. Using hard-nosed financial analysis, we see that their value has not been found in investor returns. Rather, their value was found somewhere else, in Putin's geopolitical ledger. And as far as the Kremlin is concerned, there is no contradiction in this arrangement. The arrangement is a trade-off between maximizing shareholder return, including that to Russia's treasury, and propping up Russian domestic and foreign policy objectives and enriching Putin's circle. The market has certainly not rewarded Gazprom and Rosneft for the recent financial performances. In mid-April, Gazprom's market capitalization stood at $59 billion, an 84% slump from its 2008 peak of $367 billion. Rosneft's market capitalization was $44 billion, half of its $80 billion valuation when it went public in 2006. It was a far cry from Putin's claim, confidently in 2008, with Gazprom at the top of the market, that it would soon be worth $1 trillion. Even the money-losing car ride company Uber, with no physical assets and revenues 1/10 the size of Gazprom or Rosneft, commands a similar market valuation. Investors see little improvement ahead based on the company's price-to-earnings multiple, or PE multiple. The PE multiple indicates how investors value a company based on its perceived earnings prospects. Gazprom and Rosneft have very low PEs of 2.8 and 4.7 times, respectively. By comparison, investors see primary international competitors, Chevron, ExxonMobil, BP, Royal Dutch Shell, Total, and Equinor, as much better bets with much higher PE multiples. How about earnings efficiency? Another yardstick is revenue earned per employee. Western energy companies such as BP or Royal Dutch Shell report 10 times higher revenue over employee performance than Gazprom or Rosneft. Anyway, a high market valuation for Rosneft and Gazprom, Russia's national champions, has never been the Kremlin's priorities. Alexei Miller, chief executive of Gazprom since 2001, has seen his, can you imagine this? Alexei is talking. Alexei Miller, chief executive of Gazprom since 2001, has seen his company lose over $300 billion in market value since 2008, and has stayed in Putin's good graces. The value that Gazprom and Rosneft hold for the Kremlin is in their ability to further the domestic economic, political, and even personal goals of Putin and those close to him. This includes maintaining employment and social economic stability in Russia's far-flung, economically struggling regions, supporting commercially unsustainable undertakings, and providing what many experts contend is a continuous source of largesse to Putin and company. We will discuss several aspects of these activities today. This way of doing business may be sustainable as long as Gazprom and Rosneft remain profitable and maintain resilient financial structures. But in its inefficiency, this model is vulnerable to major shocks to the world economy that drive commodity prices lower, or another technological revolution, including changes in renewable energy or in global energy dynamics as governments address climate crisis. We can conclude that Gazprom and Rosneft do not necessarily work for all their shareholders. Their continually depressed stock values show that investors who drew their conclusions in the last decade have not altered their view. This dynamic, Ambassador Morningstar, is unlikely to change soon.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen, for your comments and summary of the report in a very efficient manner, let's say. You really covered the points. But let me go to Ed Chow, and let me ask two questions for you to respond to and any general remarks that you have about the report. And that is, how relevant is all of this financial information that we've been hearing? As long as the state supports these companies to carry out its political missions, does it really matter what the actual finances are, as long as they at least can sustain themselves to some extent? And then the other question, Ed, is how much should we be concerned about Gazprom and Rosneft at this point? Given all of in the report, it talks about all of the steps that have been taken in Europe, for example, and Stephen mentioned several of them. And given the low price market, the availability of alternatives such as LNG, how concerned should we be about those companies, and maybe more particularly Gazprom, given its dominant position in Europe?
Thank you, Dick. First of all, let me say that I appreciate your invitation and Anders' invitation to participate in this distinguished panel. I had a chance to read Stephen's first drafts of the report that he started last year. And I have to say that he pretty much convinced me not to invest my retirement money in of Rosneft shares. So I really think it's a fine piece of work that everyone should take a look at. I think in answer to your two questions, Dick, I mean, clearly the majority shareholder has a different measure of success or a way of measuring the performance of the two national champions, which is not represented by PE ratios or market cap or return on shareholders' equity, that the classic measures that you should judge a company by. So clearly they have different interests that they're pursuing, and I think that's in the area that Anders and Agnia will contribute on. But the question still remains, I think, for Russia as a country, whether having these two dominant market players is a good thing or not. And I would submit that in a large energy resource base and market like Russia, one shouldn't want to have any single company have a 40% share of oil production and a 2/3 share of gas production, because at the end of the day, it's competition that drives efficiency, and having such a dominant player probably is not going to give you the economic results that you want, even if they happen to be convenient political tools. Now, let's also remember that having national champions is not a new thing. Russia didn't start this. In our own Western history of the petroleum industry, one can think of BP, ENI, and Total as companies that started out as national champions and then over time transformed themselves into international oil companies that follow internationally accepted standards and norms. So we will see whether Gazprom or Rosneft in the long run can or will transform themselves or not if they are to perform better economically. Now, on your second question, and I think maybe Anders would agree with me on this, is that a lot of it of the development of these two national champions depends on rising oil prices that we had in the 2000s. So some of this is kind of path dependent. When oil prices shot up in Putin's second term, it enabled many of these concentration of state control over the energy sector that he clearly was inclined to begin with. And the question is, in what might be a cyclical, low to stagnant market in the foreseeable future, and certainly in the medium term, whether this is actually an opportunity to push these companies to become more efficient or not. And here, I think having to compete internationally will actually make companies more efficient than if they just stuck to their home ground where they have the comparative advantage of political patrimony. So the fact that they are operating internationally in a highly competitive market today, in a declining market, which may go beyond the normal cycles of the petroleum industry, we may be at an inflection point where oil and gas demand have already peaked, and which many people are forecasting are on decline. So is having them in the international market really such a bad thing if it forces them ultimately, in order to stay profitable, to start competing according to international rules and norms? And here's where I think particularly European competition policy, European regulation that we have seen over the last decade or so, it has already forced Gazprom, at least, to move towards a more normal market behavior. It's something that we should all watch carefully, but I think the market as it is today is going to force these two companies, whether they like it or not, and maybe the majority shareholder, to think about whether the business model that they've had is really ideal for them.
So do you think at this point that Gazprom in Europe, for example, is a dangerous dominant supplier, or are they already forced to recalibrate to a huge extent, prices coming way down, there being alternatives, that it's not as big a problem? Or is that an oversimplified question?
I think certainly to a large degree, they've had to. The competition case has removed many of the sort of anti-market practices of destination clauses, oil indexation, and so on. By the way, devices that were originated with Shell when they tried to develop the Groningen field in Holland. So many of these have kind of legitimate, normal business reasons for why, when you're financing projects that requires tens of billions of dollars of capital spending, why you would want to secure the market ahead of time. But the market has changed. So some of the practices that were justified, perhaps at one time, is no longer justified. And so Gazprom has had to meet the market. I would note that in the last few weeks, European gas hub prices are on par or lower than Henry Hub. So clearly, we are seeing a competitive European gas market today, to a point where there's little room actually for LNG. Gas on gas competition is what you should want to have if you're a consumer country. And that's where Europe has been moving towards, and I think that's where it has achieved so far.
Let me turn to, thank you, Ed. Let me turn to Agnia. I have a feeling you may take a somewhat less sanguine view about the situation with respect to Gazprom. What are your reactions, one, to the report, and two, to some of the comments that Ed made in answer to my questions?
Well, absolutely, and thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. First, I'd like to emphasize and agree with the point that the market has changed. And I think the market has changed not only in a cyclical type of way, but really that we're in a new structural phase. And I think this new structural phase for the global energy markets really highlights the vulnerabilities and the failings of Russia's national champions. Of course, over the last 5 years, we've experienced the full effects of the US shale boom. The United States has emerged as the largest natural gas producer and oil producer in the world. The rise of LNG trade in respect to piped gas trade has also continuously grown. And now analysts talk about not about fears of energy supply or gas supply, but rather of peak demand for fossil fuels. So I think in this new context, Gazprom and Rosneft do face extraordinarily more amount of competition. They face a buyer's market, and they face a changed environment for the long term. Now, to what extent they will still, companies like Gazprom will still be able to maintain their geopolitical influence in Europe and beyond. Being national champions and working strategically to advance the long-term interests of the state, I think they will. More so, let's say, if we compare it to the small and independent producers that dominate the US energy markets. And that's quite a dramatic difference. In the United States, 80% of oil produced in the US is produced by independent producers. And 90% of natural gas liquids in the United States is also produced by smaller independent producers. So these are very, very different players, and their strategic reach, their geopolitical influence is also very different. Companies like, again, Gazprom and Rosneft versus American smaller producers. And we've seen as a result, Gazprom still being able to pursue their long-term projects like Nord Stream 2. Now, of course, there's been sanctions. We'll see their full effect, but Turk Stream 2 was completed. Russia is also expanding their LNG trade with newer players like NovaTech, which has been very competitive in the European gas markets, a private company, in particularly trading LNG. We've seen continued exploration in the Arctic, again, as many Western, more commercially minded companies have pulled out. So I think Gazprom and Rosneft will continue to play their more geostrategic roles, more serving the interests of the Russian state, but they will do so in a completely different market, which is in a new structural phase. So we are in a new era, and how they will compete and succeed in this new era, we'll see.
Great, thank you for that answer. Let me just follow up with one question before going to Anders. You mentioned NovaTech and NovaTech being able to compete in the LNG market. How successful do you think they can be? And is that a positive development, as seemed to be indicated by some of the earlier speakers, in creating a competitive market in Russia? Will they be allowed to compete and play a significant role in the LNG market?
Well, NovaTech certainly was the first company that started exporting LNG. Everyone expected Gazprom would do that, but NovaTech kind of took the crown and they ran with it, and they've done very well. And I think they will continue to do very well in the European LNG markets. That will raise questions, of course, for many of the countries that sought to diversify away from Russian gas. So while they will, and they have diversified away from Russian and Gazprom piped gas, they are now buying NovaTech's LNG. This is certainly, I think, it's a more positive development because it does create more competition and more diversification. Now, what kind of a player NovaTech will evolve to be? Will it evolve to be, commercially minded and operating company? Or whether the Kremlin will exert greater control over this company in the future in various forms, and it will also, let's say, become an actor of Kremlin's geopolitical interests, again, remains to be seen. But overall, the increased diversification and competition is very welcome in the European gas markets.
I might add anecdotally that a lot of people were stunned last year. I'm from Boston. And a lot of people were stunned, given the advances, of course, in the U.S. gas market, that an LNG tanker from NovaTech, with NovaTech gas, came into Boston Harbor because of the screwed up pipeline system that still exists in New England. So, I mean, it was sort of fascinating to see that the U.S. was actually buying some NovaTech.
Absolutely, and I wrote about this in the New York Times
right.
as it happened. It was a very interesting anecdote, as you say, but it really highlighted, despite the fact that the U.S. had emerged as the largest gas producer, and despite the fact that it has emerged as an LNG exporter that started encroaching on Gazprom's markets in Eastern Europe. On the other hand, because of the infrastructural issues and because of the global gas market specifically, because there's competition today across the globe for markets at any instant based on pricing, that NovaTech successfully brought gas to the United States in the winter season.
Yeah. Okay, good, thanks. Let me go to Anders, the co-author. And Anders, if you can give sort of your responses to some of the remarks that have been made, or anything else that you would like to briefly bring up before we get to more questions and answers.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dig. It's quite interesting to listen carefully to people, and one realizes what one agrees and not agrees upon. And my view of Rosneft and Gazprom is much more pessimistic on their account. We are now in a low price environment. Oil prices were low, around $20 per barrel from 81 until 2000. Then they started rising and stayed high until 2014. Since 2014, we have had low oil prices, and they will stay low for another decade or so, because commodity prices typically moves in long cycles of 25, 30 years. And so we are in a long cycle now. And these two companies, they have cheap production. Production is not the problem. It's not what we focus upon. Their biggest problem, I would argue, is corporate governance. What Steve discussed, whom they are working for. And I would put it in this order. Steve wants to put geopolitical first. I put personal first. The Putin and friends take out since 2004 about $10-15 billion a year from Gazprom alone. That's the main purpose of the company. The second is geopolitical, and the third is domestic politics, to make sure that there is gas everywhere and that there is no unrest. And then finally comes the company. So it's not by chance that Gazprom's stock price has fallen from by 85% since 2008. So here I contradict what Ed said about the good thing being on the international market. the Gazprom leadership and the Kremlin couldn't care less about the prices. So the market prices. So instead, they continue and just want to cash in on the company and pursue geopolitics. And then the situation has fundamentally changed, which both Ed and Agnia touched upon. It's the market that has driven down the low prices. The second point is technology, which is energy saving that has been massive in Europe, and LNG. And LNG has now become the price setter. It's not much LNG now that is being exported, but that is the price setter. And then, which Ed discussed, the EU competition policy has been very effective, and it's becoming more and more effective because the EU competition policy is quite independent from the government. And then a fourth point that was not much touched upon here is the US sanctions. I don't think that Nord Stream 2 will be completed. When the US decides to sanction something, it can sanction, and it can go step by step. And the ultimate sanction is to take off Gazprom and Rosneft, which are fundamentally organized crime syndicates run by the Kremlin kleptocracy, from the bank system. If Gazprom was 1% of its current size, it would be prohibited by money laundering regulations from operating in the Western banking system. So this is where we eventually should come. So I think that they are very weak in legal and commercial and economic terms. And I don't think that they can be reformed, as Ed suggested, become more efficient, because the fundamental role is to enrich the Kremlin kleptocracy. Is this bad or good? It's very good, because low oil and gas prices, that means more democracy and more peace. We had the big third democratic wave, as Samuel Huntington called it, in the 1990s. We are now going back to more freedom in the world, I think. So I'm quite optimistic, because I think Rosneft and Gazprom are in terrible state. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. Let me ask a couple of follow-up questions. I think this was mentioned in the report, but there was, as you've often mentioned and referred to, I guess, today, some opposition politicians have found that $60 billion worth of contracts and assets have gone to contractors who were friends of Putin. I would ask you, what if any effect did that report have, and has there been any payback or blowback against the people who issued the report? And then the other question to follow up on, and it's one of the questions that has come from the audience, has the reduction in revenues and profits and potentially continuing reduction in revenues, what effect is that having on the overall Russian economy?
Yeah, so on the first point, the report was written by my late good friend Boris Nemtsov, who was shot dead outside of the Kremlin on the 27th of February 2015. And John Dunlop at the Hoover Institution has written a book about it and investigated thoroughly, suggesting that in all probability it was Putin who ordered that murder. The other author was our good friend Vladimir Milov, whom we have had with many Atlantic Council events last a week ago, and he's still in Moscow. He's now Alexei Navalny's deputy for economic policy, and he's amazingly unafraid and lives well in Moscow and travels around the country agitating. Of course, he's not on media, but he runs his own YouTube channel with about 50,000 people who look up on his program, Where is the Money?, where he exactly discusses these questions once a week. So the Russian situation is funny, but you see people who survive, or at least for quite some time, while pointing out these things. With regard to the effect on the Russian economy, I can give you one straight number. The central bank did a study last September on how much lower oil price would cost GDP. And their answer was that if the oil price in 2020 is $25 per barrel rather than $65 per barrel, GDP will be 4% less. So you can say 1% of GDP less for $10 per barrel. That's the rule of thumb for the Russian economy. But if you look upon how it's being adjusted, Russia's GDP, which was $1.65 trillion for the last several years, will probably be $1.3 trillion this year, primarily because of a much lower exchange rate, but also because of falling GDP.
Well, except that the prices have stabilized to some extent. I mean, they're still low, but they're up to about, what, $37 a barrel or something like that at this point. Whether they'll stay there is, a whole nother question. Let me go now to the whole panel again. And we've talked a lot about Gazprom, a little bit about NovaTech. Haven't talked that much about Rosneft. And question I would have, Rosneft has made a lot of investments outside of Russia, including what they've done in Venezuela, and which I think is creating serious problems for them. How overextended has Rosneft gotten? Or is there any way that they're going to be able to maintain these investments in a market that where much investment is being delayed, if not canceled, because of the ramifications of the pandemic and the expected continued drop in demand and prices? I could ask any of you to answer that. If nobody pipes up, I'll pick on somebody. Anders, maybe you can start.
Yeah, well, Rosneft tends to be overextended all the time. It has been very overextended when it bought TNK-BP in 2012-2013. And what it did then was that it took $40 billion of debt for buying TNK-BP for $55 billion. And this led to a financial crisis for Russia in December 2014. And that was it. The exchange rate fell to 80 rubles per dollar from having been 30 rubles per dollar early that year. And then it came back. It caused real panic. And the funny thing is that Putin allowed Igor Sechin, the great adventurers, to do that. And after having done that, Sechin did pretty much the same thing in December 2016, when he privatized 19.5% of Rosneft to unknown beneficiaries. My strong guess is that there were two major beneficiaries, Igor Sechin and Vladimir Putin. This has been hidden in many layers of offshore companies in Cayman Island that we know, but we don't know who are the ultimate beneficiaries of this $10 billion. And this was financed, eventually it became clear, with bonds that Rosneft issued, and that were then going through the Russian banking system, central bank, and various state banks and Bank Открытия, which then went under the next year, so that there were no unnecessary traces. And now again, we see that Igor Sechin starts the oil price war, which in early March this year. So Rosneft is destabilizing, it overextends itself, and when it's sufficiently overextended, it doesn't get any more money from Putin, and then Igor Sechin has to be calm for a little while. This is, of course, no way of running an economy. This is no way of running it. And it's only two people who matter, Putin and Sechin.
Has Venezuela blown up in Sechin's face? What are the effects of them turning their assets over to another company? They had sanctions. Rosneft and Sechin both had sanctions put on them as a result of Venezuela. How bad a situation is that for Rosneft?
Are you asking me? I would say that this is not very bad for Rosneft. It was about $8.5 billion that Rosneft had put up altogether, $4 billion in assets. It sold it now to an, as yet, I think, unnamed state company. Perhaps it has got a name. This is what Russia does in Crimea, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, frozen territories and annexed territories. So the strange thing was that Rosneft had a major subsidiary of its own dealing with Venezuela. So Sechin, who's by no means cautious, didn't pursue the normal Russian caution in handling sanction issues. And now they have got rid of it. It doesn't mean that Russia is doing more or less in Venezuela. It only means that we are doing it in the normal fashion that Sechin had not bothered about.
I would very much compare this overextension of Rosneft to the overextension of Kremlin's foreign policy. They're both overextended in, you can say, in a similar fashion. On the other hand, they kind of keep going. They keep pushing the envelope, and where the final straw will fall remains to be seen. On the other hand, this kind of reminds me a little bit of the NBA type of business playbook. When a company is nearing bankruptcy, sometimes the best option to deflect the problems is acquisition, and that's what I see a little bit with Russia's foreign policy. With an ability to address the domestic problems, there is an attempt for further acquisition abroad. And similarly with Rosneft, with the inefficiencies in the business, there's still a continued pursuit of overextension and further acquisitions outside of Russia.
Thank you, Agnia. Stephen, go ahead.
Well, just looking at Rosneft's 2019 annual report, you find that of all of their international investments, only 1.1% of Rosneft's total revenues came from international investments. So
that is interesting.
The economic impact is very, very small.
Good. Very good point. Ed, do you have anything to add on any of this?
Well, yes. It seems to me that what we're saying is that companies like Rosneft, under Kremlin control, do things for political reasons, whether they're domestic or foreign, and not for sound economic or financial reasons. There has to be a limit on how much they can do and remain going concerns. So this is why I think the much lower energy prices that we will see for quite a long time will force an accounting of some sort. Now, I'm not a Russia expert, so people like Anders and Agnia and yourself will know a lot more about what the reaction is going to be, but it does force some reality into what you can afford to do, even though you're desirous of doing it. I want to make another point that was raised before on NovaTech and LNG. I don't think of this as a systemic solution. I mean, after all, NovaTech was basically a franchise given to a friend to develop Yamal LNG, rather than a systemic change that opens up the entire Russian gas market. And given LNG prices today around the world, these could very well be stranded investments and not make much of a return at all. We're going to have stranded investments, I'm sorry to say, in US LNG projects as well. The difference is that these are private capital that's going to be hurt, not taxpayers' money. And the problem with putting most of your stake on national champion companies is that ultimately you're gambling with national patrimony and taxpayers' money rather than shareholders' money.
Ed, there was a question from the audience directed to you. I don't know that you would have an answer to it, but there have been two disasters, for lack of a better word, in the Russian oil industry. One, the issues with the oil being shipped to Belarus some months ago, the contaminated oil, which was a major problem. And then just in the last couple of days, this tremendous diesel fuel leak in the Arctic, which almost as bad as Exxon Valdez, apparently. And will that have any effect on Rosneft or on the oil industry in Russia, or are those just two random events that nobody will think about after a while?
I think there are definitely indications of deficiencies in the system. I think more so the problems that Transneft had with the contaminated oil. It was so much oil and so destructive in terms of Russian crude exports reputation in the European market. That clearly was a own goal that wasn't needed at all. I have talked to numerous Russian friends about what the real inside story might be. Was this really an accident, or is this sabotage of some sort inside the industry, people competing for narrow interest reasons? And I don't have a definitive answer for that, but certainly it was not helpful to the Russian oil industry's reputation overall, and it would cause, I think, naturally for European refiners to be looking for more diversity of supply sources, not to stop importing all Russian oil, but at least make sure that they have a balanced portfolio of different crude oils that they are processing. The second accident, the more recent accident, was not in a petroleum facility.
Yeah, it was a power facility, right?
Right, it was a power facility connected with a plant that processes nickel. And so, again, it shows the deficiency of the overall system. I don't think actually you can tag that one on the petroleum industry.
Well, and I'd like to just remind you that recently US oil was delivered to Belarus. So this was also
right.
Dramatic and historic event, you can say, that highlighted the US oil industry's, first steps of trying to nip at the heels of the Russian oil industry. I would liken it to the few years ago when US LNG first arrived into Poland and Lithuania, kind of the traditional markets for Gazprom.
Do you think, Agnia, from a geostrategic standpoint, the United States should be paying a lot more attention to Belarus now, given the tensions that it seems to have with Russia, even though Belarus is certainly not a symbol of democracy in any way?
It's certainly a country to watch and pay attention to, because you can say it's the last type of prize on the European continent in this geopolitical game. We've seen how the situation in Ukraine turned out, and I think the Kremlin and Putin, especially as he tries to extend his presidency and rule in the coming years, there will be also an effort to bring Belarus back into the fold in whatever form. Of course, there had been long discussions about unifying the two countries. There have been even steps taken in that direction. But we see now kind of a hesitation and a pushback from Belarus, a type of continuous flirting with the West, as they have, of course, have continued to do. So, yes, I think this is absolutely a country to watch from that perspective, and potentially a country we could see conflict like we've seen in Ukraine.
I shook hands with Lukashenko one time in 1994 And he's such a big guy, former hockey player, as some may know. My hand still hurts 26 years later. Anyway, another question, I think is actually quite an interesting question, more on the financial side. And maybe Stephen can start off on this one. Question being that given that gas prices now are significantly below the break-even price for the production of gas, apparently, in Russia, what effect, if any, is that going to have on cash flow? And will that just force the central government to fork over funds to Gazprom to keep them going? Or how big of a risk is that?
I don't think Gazprom is going to need the help from the state in terms of cash flow. And actually, if you read their first quarter presentation to investors, they clearly state that what they're going to do in response to the current situation is reduce CapEx. And if they're reducing capital expenditures, that obviously saves a lot of cash flow. It's interesting to point out, equity analysts are projecting an awful year for both Rosneft and Gazprom. I couldn't believe what I was seeing in one report. They're projecting for this year a 66% decline in revenues and profits for Gazprom, and for Rosneft, a $2 billion annual loss. So this is a major change in what these companies have experienced before. But I do feel that they can manage their cash flow effectively to still pay dividends to some extent, but clearly they're going to be watching cash much, much more carefully now than they were before, given this situation and its possibility of continuing for the more than just the short term.
Thank you. Anybody else want to chime in on that?
Yes.
Anders.
Yes, if I may, we have show in our report that Gazprom essentially doesn't like free cash flow. It tries to minimize the free cash flow. So the money is taken out through capex each year. So the more profit, in real terms, Gazprom is making, the more capital expenditures it has. The worst case was in 2011, when Gazprom had its best year ever. It had expected to spend $27 billion in that year on capex. And since it had much more money than it had expected, it spent $53 billion, twice as much. So this, I talked with investors in London and they said, well, this essentially just meant that they were shoveling out the money through the door because they got more. And who does the money go to? It goes to Putin's friends who build the pipelines. Gennady Timchenko, one of the major owners of NovaTech, and the brothers Arkady and Boris Rotenberg. So I think it was very sound that the US sanctioned all these three Putin cronies in March 2014, which Putin got very upset about and complained in public about at least 5 times. So the point here is that when they cut capex, they cut the enrichment of Putin's and his friends, and that's a serious political measure. So therefore, I think that this can be very good for in order to stimulate the inside the elite fight in Moscow that we don't know much about, but we can see if they have less money, they are likely to be disliking each other much more, because you always get fierce competition when you have such money around.
Thanks, Anders. Another question being, Miller has been the CEO of Gazprom since 2001, Sechin for Rosneft since, I guess, 2012. They each seem to have 1,000 lives. Why have they lasted so long, and how long can they last, do you think?
Well, I would argue that they will last as long as Putin lasts. They are there as transmission belts. Sechin is a strong and nasty character. Miller is just weak. So it's widely presumed that Putin is the real CEO of Gazprom. And that's the reason why it's so badly managed, because the president simply doesn't have time to manage a very big company. And he does so then by having alternative groups that are checking each other. And that's no way of running a company. While Second is very much a dictator within Rosneft. They say that he looks upon his Russian vice presidents as slaves, and his four foreign first vice presidents as servants. So this is the kind of company that Rosneft is. And they have come up there because of no competence whatsoever. They have been loyal to Putin, and they worked both as his assistant in the mayor's office in St. Petersburg from 92 to 96. And then they have traveled with Putin. And Miller is just weak, and Sechin is one of the people closest to Putin, and controlled the door to Putin's office in the Kremlin during Putin's first term as president.
Thank you. We have about 3 or 4 minutes left, so at most. So what I would like to do, this has been an amazing panel. I would like each of you to take less than a minute to predict where you think Gazprom and Rosneft will be over the next 4 or 5 years. What's your prognostication given all that you've talked about? So I'll ask each of you to respond. And since you're on camera, Anders, maybe you can begin and we'll go down the line.
I think that they will be in serious financial crisis, and that this will result in a political crisis for Putin.
Short and to the point. Okay. Agnia.
I think they will show resilience despite the negative trends, despite the difficult markets they face, the more competition, and of course the financial problems. But I think they'll show resilience because they are national champions, because the state, the Russian state, depends on these companies. And I think the fact that they've had, they have long-term strategic interests that they will pursue. I think they may even succeed because, again, they're national champions. They will continue to implement long-term infrastructure like the Turk Stream project. They will pursue LNG as well. NovaTech will. So while they may experience crisis, I think they may weather it. I guess I'm more optimistic. Well, I don't know if this is optimistic or pessimistic, but I think like the Kremlin, they will continue to play their very poor hand well.
Thank you, Agnia. Ed.
Well, I think if you're looking over the next 5 years, Dick, inertia is always the safest bet. Then nothing much changes. But I think during those 5 years, it certainly should raise very, very serious questions. First of all, on the Russian economic model under Putin, whether transforming yourself into a petro state while you have other options, other resources, is the right way to go in the long run as well. And if that were to change, then certainly the national champion companies should change and should start behaving and running themselves more like businesses, shedding non-core assets, having much better procurement practices to become competitive in a market that is forcing them more and more internationally to become efficient. So, I mean, 5 years, I don't know, but 5 to 10, maybe there will be some significant changes down the road.
Thank you, Ed. And last but not least, Stephen.
Okay, what I'd like to say is that these two natural resource champions are indeed the geese that lay the golden eggs for Russia. It's clear from everything you've heard today that the golden eggs are getting smaller. And although I feel that the companies still have a good amount of resilience left to them, this is their chance to use that remaining resilience to take actions to make themselves more efficient and adopt to the new challenges in the global market. We will have to watch this space very carefully.
Thank you very much. I think we have reached the end of our time. And I might just say, again, I think it was a really terrific report that raised a lot of issues. We've had a terrific panel, excellent questions from the virtual audience. I got to a lot of them, but unfortunately couldn't get to all of them. So let me thank everybody. Let me encourage you all to continue to attend virtual programs for the Eurasia Center and for the Global Energy Center. And we do work closely together. It's a wonderfully cooperative relationship. And so, again, thank you. And I think it's time to sign off.
Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye-bye.